life dedicated to the gods, but a life of suffering. What comes to mind when you think of the Olympics today? Glory, fame, victory, perhaps a grand stage of success watched by the whole world. But what if I told you that when the Olympics first began, they weren't so grand? In fact, in ancient Greece, being an athlete often meant pain, shame, and death. The first Olympics, which began in 776 BC, were held as a sacred ceremony dedicated to Zeus. Athletes competed in sacred areas, in the presence of the gods. But this competition wasn't just for the gods. Winning could make a man immortal, while losing could be so humiliating that it would erase him from history. And here's the strange part. Within these sacred ceremonies lay some of the strangest, most unsettling details of human history. Why was everyone naked? Get over your initial shock. Yes, all athletes were naked, but this was not just so they could move comfortably. In ancient Greece, nudity represented the divinity of the body. The athlete's body was a work of art offered to the gods, but this art often turned into entertainment for the public. Competing naked in front of hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, was an embarrassing situation, especially for young athletes. In fact, some spectators, especially older aristocrats, would gaze at the athletes with sexual admiration. So this was not just sports, but also a stage where the body was displayed, and the athlete's consent was often absent. The training was merciless. It was easy to want to participate in the Olympics, but preparing for it was pure torture. Athletes would wake up before dawn, run barefoot on stone ground, and spend hours wrestling, jumping, and lifting weights. Coaches were not motivational like they are today, but rather people who made noise wherever they went. Yelling at struggling athletes was commonplace, but sometimes whips were even used. And let's not forget, most athletes went through this process as children. A 13 or 14-year-old child receiving combat training on a stone floor morning and night. How healthy does that sound today? Nutrition: superstitious, unbalanced, unhealthy. You may say, protein is essential for a muscular body. But in ancient Greece, this was governed by superstition. Athletes were told to eat pig liver to become stronger. Some competitors believed that you must eat goat brain to achieve victory. There were no dietitians in the modern sense. The purpose of eating was not performance, but to fulfill superstitions. Moreover, carbohydrates were almost forbidden. Bread, fruit, and grain consumption was limited. Athletes who starved themselves and ate only meat were often seen fainting and being eliminated on competition day. Pankration: win or die. Today you watch MMA, isn't it exciting? Pankration was its ancestor, but with one difference: it was okay to die. Choking, breaking, stepping on the fallen. The only rule was no eye gouging. But there were those who did that too. Some athletes were considered winners at the end of the fight, were still considered winners even if they lay motionless, because it was believed they had fought until death. Those who died in these fights were considered accepted by the gods, and the people honored them as heroes. So dying was better than losing. If you win, a statue will be erected in your honor. If you lose, you will be erased. Success could immortalize a person in ancient Greece. Statues were erected to the winners, and victory ceremonies were held at the entrance to their cities. But what about the losers? Their names were not even mentioned. In some cities, losing athletes were humiliated as if they had committed treason against their country. Therefore, an athlete participating in the Olympics would either go down in history or be forgotten by history. Body oiling and sweat trade. Athletes rubbed olive oil and sand on their bodies, but this wasn't just for lubrication. After the race, this mixture was scraped off, and the mixture full of sweat, oil, and dust was bottled. It was called gloios. It was sold to the wealthy as a healing potion. Yes, this sweaty liquid was considered a kind of medical product. It sounds disgusting today, but it was big business at the time. Even watching the races was forbidden for women. Being a woman in ancient Greece was difficult, and being an athlete was impossible. Women were forbidden from participating in the Olympics. They were even forbidden from watching. According to legend, a woman who dressed as a man to watch the games was sentenced to death. Only in places like Sparta were women allowed to participate in sports, but this was an exception. Although women participated in separate competitions for goddesses, they never reached the Olympic level. Crowds, smells, and chaos at the Olympics. While the competitions were taking place in Olympia, the city was like an open-air prison. Tens of thousands of people would come. There were no toilets, no clean water. Extreme heat, watching naked under the sun, endless shouting, and the smell of sweat. The Olympics may have been sacred to the gods, but for humans, it was a festival of torment. How the Olympics really worked in ancient Greece. Today, the Olympics are filled with ceremonies, sponsors, live broadcasts, and controlled organization. But in ancient Greece, things were very different. And yes, the word chaotic would be spot on. Everything was a religious event held in honor of Zeus. Before the Olympics began, all city-states would cease hostilities. The sacred fire would be lit, and sacrifices would be offered to the gods. The atmosphere was mystical, sometimes even eerie. It wasn't just about sports. Rituals, prophecies, and offerings to the gods were also part of it. Athletes would wash themselves with sacred water and receive approval from priests before competing. But once they stepped onto the field, things got serious. The rules were ruthless. For example, in wrestling, the match would continue until one person gave up. Referees walked the field with sticks in hand, immediately penalizing those who broke the rules. Seeing blood was commonplace. But this was a struggle offered to the gods. The Olympics were a mix of sacredness, courage, and spectacle, far removed from today's sterile atmosphere, more primitive, yet just as captivating. Why did ancient Greek athletes cover their bodies in oil? In ancient Greece, an athlete had to be not only strong, but also beautiful. Physical appearance was considered a divine attribute. That is why athletes covered their bodies with olive oil before competitions. At first, the purpose of this practice was quite logical: to protect themselves from the sun, to keep their muscles warm, to keep their skin soft and healthy. But over time, the aesthetic and religious aspects of this practice also came to the fore. The oiled body became a symbol of sacredness. Athletes transformed into figures resembling gods, glowing with radiance. And the commercial aspect? The mixture of sweat and oil from athletes after competitions was scraped off with special tools and sold. Yes, those sweaty oils were considered medicinal and sold under the name Gloria. Some people bought the mixture because it was said to relieve muscle pain. For others, it was the scent of victory. Unbelievable, but true. Why losing was shameful in ancient Greece. Today, if an athlete loses, they bow their head and walk away. They may be criticized a little on social media, but then it passes. But in ancient Greece, defeat was a social disgrace. An athlete participating in the Olympics did not compete only for themselves. The honor of the city-state they represented was also on their shoulders. If they won, a statue would be erected in their honor. They would be exempt from taxes, and they would even be honored for life. But if they lost, their name would not be mentioned. Their city would turn its back on them. Some would even be so ashamed that they would never compete again. Success was sacred in Greek society. Victory was seen as the approval of the gods. Losing was like turning your back on the gods. According to legend, an athlete who lost a race did not speak for months, because he had not only defeated his body, but also brought shame upon his city's pride. In ancient Greece, losing was not just a result, it was being erased from society. And as you can see, being an athlete in ancient Greece was very different from what we know today. The struggle was not only against opponents, but also against the expectations of society, the gaze of the gods, and one's own honor. Oily bodies, the burden of sacred status, dazzling victories, and deep shame. All of this shows that sports were not just a physical arena, but also a cultural and spiritual one. If you enjoy this kind of historical background and are curious about stories from the dusty pages of the past that resonate today, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated on new videos. The secrets of the ancient world are far from over. We'll see you in the next video with an even more fascinating topic. Stay with history, stay curious.